this off. This session is, well, let me take care. Regional conservation initiatives, opportunities for LCCs to define the conservation landscape of the 21st century. And the session was kind of put together to start thinking about larger initiatives that in some cases were initiated even before LCCs became a reality. And thinking about these larger initiatives from a regional perspective, how can LCCs facilitate those initiatives? How can they show some leadership? And hopefully maybe how they could take some ownership in helping them to come to some fruition and being completed. So we have two examples of those regional initiatives, and I think you've all probably heard of some other examples earlier on some stuff that's going out on the western part of the country, but these two examples are in the eastern part. We have two presenters. We're roughly going to think about 15 to 20 minutes in terms of a presentation, and then opportunities for questions after each presentation, and we have an hour to get this done. So my name is Greg Wathen. I'm the moderator for this session, and I'm the coordinator for the Gulf Coastal Plains and Ozarks LCC. So the first presentation is going to be on the Southeastern Conservation Adaptation Strategy. The presenter is Tim Breaux, who is the coordinator for the Peninsular Florida LCC. Tim and I share some experiences together. We're both former chiefs of wildlife for state fish and wildlife agencies, Tim in Florida, myself in Tennessee. So we have a lot of commonalities in terms of our experiences and where we come from in our past lives before LCCs came along. So with that, Tim, I appreciate it.
Thanks, and I'll try to keep this pretty quick, and so I don't want to stand between you guys and lunch. The Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategies is a concept right now. We don't have a plan. We're not going to make a plan. And it's a multi-partner enterprise. It's going to take federal partners, state partners, the science community, a lot of people. And so it's kind of a work in progress, and I'll kind of tell you kind of why this kind of came to be. There's a need to do this on a broad geographic area, and the reasons being are very simple, that what we're facing in terms of environmental stressors and resource stressors far transcend any political authorities, responsibilities of certain organizations, and the goals and objectives for landscape sustainability are far beyond the scope or reach of any organization. They don't have the capacity. So these two bullets talk to capacity to do big tasks across a large landscape. The second need, there's two bullets here, and they both speak to competency and capacity. A lot of the new stressors we're dealing with are going to require new competencies, new skill sets. And in the past, resource management agencies have built their own competency and their own capacity to meet new needs. And I'd argue with you that we're going to need to move from that model of stovepipe model of everybody builds their own, meets their own needs, is to get to a collaborative form of conservation, not a competitive one, where we have to get to the bottom of the issue. The bottom issue is, what's your core? What can you do better than anybody else in the world? And things that you aren't best in the world at, go find a partner. And that's probably how we're going to have to advance collaborative conservation and give up some of the stuff that we are doing right now and partner more people who do it better, quicker, cheaper. The geography, southeastern U.S., and I know you're going to look at Missouri, Texas. Okay, so it also includes, we always kind of forget these guys, the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico and U.S. Virgin Islands. Okay, this is why. There's an organization called the Southeastern Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and that's the geography they cover. This association was formed in the late 40s, early 50s, and been in existence for almost 75 years. And these are the Southeastern Fish and Wildlife Agencies, including Missouri, West Virginia, up on the northern end. And it's a self-directed partnership, and they've worked together on a lot of complex issues in the past that have related to wildlife restoration, fish restoration issues. Membership is, like I said, the state fish and wildlife agencies and the DNRs in both Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. We initially approached this group to say, does this make sense to you to use the CAFWA, this group's geography, as our kind of our planning polygon? And they endorsed the concept of the adaptation strategy. And so we've got the green light to move forward to start engage other partners, including federal partners, NGO, science community. So what are we looking at in terms of the adaptation strategy? What's coming at us? What's coming our way? Most of you are well aware. You've seen these maps of urban population growth. Looks pretty ugly. You know, if you're in the Appalachians, that's a new phenomenon pretty much. Florida, we're toast. You know, so you know that's a big problem. Solar potential. You know, we've all heard about renewable energy. This is another stressor that may be coming your way. I never thought I'd see solar energy panels for farms in Florida, but yet it's happening. I thought the real estate values were too high, but I had to rethink that because they're happening, and they do eat up lots of habitat. They're very big. The wind potential. Folks out here in the West, you're there. You've seen it. It's all around us. If it's not in your neighborhood, it's coming. Even in places you wouldn't expect it. They're looking all over the continental U.S. to put in wind generation farms. Shale and coal deposits. All of you have heard of hydrofracking? You know, that's basically a new technology that's going to basically develop these shale oil deposits, and so we may see a lot more accelerated development in places that have not traditionally experienced oil and gas development. Traditional gas and oil development, here's a map of 1900 to present. They've pretty well covered the geography of the Southeast. It's already out there. It's a current stressor, and will probably continue. Also, water stress. Water is real important in the Southeast. We get a lot of rainfall. It's abundant for most of it, except for Texas, perhaps, in the parts of the Midwest. But nonetheless, it's a driver for a lot of our aquatic systems and a lot of our terrestrial systems as well. This comes from Florida Futures. It's probably one of their most extreme examples, but you can see that there's a big potential there. And I want to point out Florida. It's a peninsula. It gets abundant rainfall because of onshore currents, and it brings rain with it. If it was not a peninsula, it would be a desert. It's on the same latitude as the Chihuahuan Desert, the Sonoran Desert, the Sahara Desert, if you take a map of the globe. So changes in rainfall are very important to Florida because we could become a sand spit. Climate change forecast. You can see the Southeast hotter, drier, less water. And so there's other, you know, that's another impact that as a stressor that's going to impact our future conservation estate. So what we did, basically there's 6 LCCs that are involved in this effort. And that's probably pretty good from the Southeastern Director's viewpoint because every Southeastern state operates in multiple LCCs. So there may be an efficiency mechanism here as well, but this is a current conservation estate. If you look at this map, there's a lot of coastal properties, particularly in Florida, that could be inundated by sea level rise. So where we can't assume that the current conservation estate is a steady state. So we need to start with, this step was to say, what do we got out there already? We also asked our state partners, said, okay, send us information that we can compile about important areas to you, important to fish and wildlife. There's a caveat here. Every state collects data in a little different way. They have different reasons for how they assemble the data. That probably points to a need, too, that if we work together, we maybe make a prettier picture. This is kind of one of those pixelated maps, if you heard the plenary talk yesterday. It doesn't join up real good. But these are important areas for people right now. There are other important areas, too. So we asked other people, TNC, and they have their portfolio. So here's another map of other important areas for conservation. Southeast Aquatic Resource Partners, they have identified important areas, for fish and wildlife conservation. Migratory Bird Ventures have also said, here are areas that are important to us. And so the challenge is going to be to maintain that landscape connectivity, ecosystem function across a large landscape in the face of pretty rapidly escalating stressors. Okay, what's the future going to look like? This was a GIS programmer's dream, I think. This is kind of an overlay of everything that's going on out there, and this truly is a pixelated picture. It does not look to me like a coherent picture of what a future or sustainable future might look like. So the need then is to say, if we don't like this picture, then what are we going to do about that? Well, the future's not always clear. And there's a lot of trepidation of, well, how can you forecast that? And being in a Gulf Coast state and well aware of hurricanes, I think hurricanes is a perfect analogy for what we want to do as a strategy. All strategies have cones of uncertainty. The closer you are to the issue, the clearer the picture is. So when a hurricane comes off the Cape Verde Islands in Africa, and I'm in Florida, I don't worry too much. If it gets to Cuba, I'm going, uh-oh, is it north or south of Cuba? If it's south of Cuba, it may hit the Yucatan. If it's north of Cuba, it's going to go in the Gulf of Mexico. But these models, interesting enough, are the closer you get, they can refine the certainty of what's going on. Also, importantly, this is not one model. These hurricane tracking charts are developed from 9 or 10 models that all help the robustness of this prediction. So adaptation strategies are we're going to have to look at the speed and the trajectory of the change. And those will help drive decisions, but it's going to be a very iterative process. If you notice, hurricanes are never linear. They're affected by other events, the temperature of the Gulf, overhead wind speeds, a lot of things that happen that change their path. So the role for the LCCs that we see of value is to help engage the conservation and science communities and to be a catalyst to bring that community together in the Southeast. A strategy is not a plan. We're not going to make a plan because you can't. It's too dynamic. But it's more a way of how you work with each other, where people can work within their competencies, work within their authorities and their organizational mandates to help sustain, a future for the conservation. And also to seek broader engagement. It's not going to be just the LCCs and the state agencies, but federal partners, local partners, private sector folks, to take a lot of people. And so I've plagiarized this from Dr. Bill Uline, and he's kind of outlined, some criteria, things that need to be in a strategy, things that kind of the toolbox, things you need to consider. And the first is the ability to see the system, and that's basically what's the current state and predict it into the future. And Dan Ash came to Florida not too long ago to speak to a class that the state of Florida put on climate change. And I've heard a lot of trepidation in the conservation community of how can you forecast anything? And that's just very difficult. They don't understand models, and they're very uncomfortable with that. It's different than the science the resource management science they've used in the past. And Dan's analogy was this, in the last 60 years, we've been able, as a conservation community, to drive forward by looking in the rearview mirror. Most of our science was retrospective, as life histories and looking at things that happened in the past, to assemble it, to predict the future. He says, we can't do that anymore. He said, the road is not straight anymore. So it's got curves, bumps, up and down, so we're going to have to forecast our way forward, where we can't see our way forward. Conservation delivery tools are going to be very important. Those are decision support tools. Metrics, conservation targets will be very important. It may vary from individual species to plant and animal communities to entire intact ecosystems. You also need an adaptive management framework. And Bill says something I think is absolutely just on target. Learning needs to be an explicit part of this. And I don't think that's always been the case in the past. We need to learn from what we do. That's a very different tack than just going out and doing things. Conservation assessment science is going to be needed too. Geospatial analyses, landscape ecology linked with GIS capability, all that will be needed. Risk management tools, these are very important. People's risk tolerances are very different. And depending on where you are, your risk may be higher or lower. And so you need to do assessment, find out what people's tolerance are, and then actually set trigger points for action. Monitoring, and I'm not talking about biological monitoring here, I'm talking about monitoring the strategy. But it's about testing and assessing uncertainty and the assumptions made in management decisions. That's a very different kind of monitoring in terms of how we're doing in terms of predicting trajectory and direction. And lastly, public engagement is going to be real important. What's important to people matters, and the conservative state of the future will depend on what people want. And it always has been that way, always will be that way. And so we need to quantify the values of a changing society. And our society is changing demographically, age structure. We need to understand what their values are. We're going to have to look at current policies and regulations that may not work for us as well. A lot of our policies are place-based. They're directed toward a spot that may not work for us anymore. We're going to have to engage the citizenry in terms of citizen science. There's going to be a lot of biological and ecological monitoring needs out there that far transcend our abilities to do so. And lastly, grassroots conservation delivery. I think you've heard a lot of speakers talk about it gets to look, the strategy becomes local at some point in time in terms of actual delivery on the ground. And so why do we need to get this right? Pretty simple. We can't leave the planet. We can't go to the moon. We have to live where we are right now. So that's my last slide, and I'll be happy to entertain a few questions. Thank you.
We've got time for a couple of questions for Tim. Anybody?
Tim, one thing, looking at this the landscape scale, the partnership has been going on for a long time among fish and wildlife agencies. But one hole I see in this is that none of the marine agencies are involved. So that's marine and coastal management, and it would seem that would be important as there's consideration in adding that.
Yes, and the LCCs that are going to be guiding this are very active in the marine environment. In fact, Lori Rounds is here. Lori works for NOAA, but we contribute half-time to her salary to help the Gulf Coast LCCs, the 4 of them that touch the Gulf of Mexico, to make sure we're connecting with that community.
Yes, Dennis Figg, Missouri Department of Conservation. You commented that a lot of policy is place-based, and you indicated that was a problem, and so I just need to understand that better.
Okay, I'll give you an example, a Florida example. The Endangered Species Act, it's where critters are right now. Florida Keys has a lot of endemic species down there that are subspecies. We have something called a key deer, and it's a diminutive deer, small, and the reason it's small, it's nutritionally impoverished because it lives on an island system, bad nutrition. So if the Keys are inundated through climate change, what do? There's no way we can, if we move the deer to mainland Florida and turn it loose, it's going to become another white-tailed deer. So do you put it in a zoo? Do you put it, do you move it to an island in the Caribbean? If you're a national park, you've got certain things that you have to say, maintain this as a wilderness area. And the stressors may mean more direct management, because wilderness designation right now has limitations about what you can do there. So to preserve that ecological integrity, which is a function of the National Park Service, hands-off management may be a problem in the future. Those are 2 examples that kind of relate to thinking about things being in a steady state in terms of climate.
Is this on? Real close. Okay. In the western United States, cumulative impacts are still an important issue from a planning standpoint. Based on the scenario you created up there with the Southeast, there are so many cumulative impacts. Is it beyond the ability to plan for such issues?
I think we have an ability to plan from here on out. There are already impacts out there, and we can't ignore that. But I think there's a path forward. It's going to take all of society in terms of community planners, transportation people, energy development, to be part of the process of saying what lands do we need to protect for fish and wildlife and cultural values, and then move those other activities somewhere else.
Well, with respect to the LCCs, I mean, it would seem to me that that's an extremely important science gap that we need to fill. And I guess my question is anybody working on that in the Southeast to look at cumulative impacts of all of those things you were trying to
We all will need to work on that. Let's be part of that dialogue we have, that conversation we have of the path forward.
Tim, is there a process laid out for developing this strategy yet, or?
It's in progress. We started deliberately with the directors to kind of get their buy-in because they were a very important partner. But at this point, we need to sit down and engage other partners about the concept and then actually start sitting down and getting the partners to help us work together. The LCC does not have the capacity to do every bit of those tasks. That's the conservation community needs to all partner in to help that. We can help guide that. We can manage the dialogue. We have some capacity for providing some science, but no, we have to bring the entire community together. It's going to be a stepwise process of reaching out, getting some buy-in, and then finding out who the partners are. So we'll be knocking on your door. Okay.
Thank you, Tim. There's seats. Yeah, there's some seats down here in the front. If anybody in the back wants to take a seat, you feel free to do that. So we're going to shift from the southeast to the northeast, and actually a lot of the thinking that generated what we're doing in the southeast came from our counterparts in the northeast and some work that they've been doing over the last several years that the LCCs kind of came in and helped to facilitate. So our presenter to talk about the Northeast Conservation Framework is Ken Elo. Ken is the Assistant Regional Director of Science Applications in the Northeast region for the Fish and Wildlife Service. Ken and I kind of go back a little ways, back when we both were working on black bears and early in our careers. And so we've crossed paths a number of times over the years in different capacities, and now it's kind of with the LCC. So, Ken, I'm glad to see you here, and thanks for coming up. Let's see. Do you want to close that down? Up here.
We also have a common background because I was with the state of Maine for 24 years, so another state director. Let's see. So I'm going to build off of what Tim was talking about, and hopefully a lot of what I'm going to talk about is not new concept. But more organizing concept. And so many of the things that Tim talked about, I think you'll see complements here. But I want to talk a little bit about, instead of data layers, I want to talk about a little bit about why we have a conservation framework and what good is it. Because this is something that we worked on for quite a while, thought about a lot, and it organically kind of came out of many of the efforts that the northeastern states have been doing for several years. So I want to give you a little bit of that history and then a little bit of what this is and what we hope it will do for us. First, this is the framework, with the geography that we're working in. The North Atlantic LCC incorporates, I believe, 12 states plus D.C., some Canadian provinces, but it's also embedded in the Northeast region, which is a 14-state area. This is the Northeastern Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, as well as the Northeast region of the Fish and Wildlife Service, and it is a geography that has been working together for quite a while. this is the challenge that we've been trying to wrestle with. You know, we've got a number of state agencies, a number of state agencies within states, as well as a number of states. We've got a lot of organizations, and we're trying to come together and do something in unison. So what is that unifying factor? What are we trying to accomplish together, and how do we organize ourselves to do that efficiently? That really is the challenge that we've got, and I think it's the challenge that, that most of you wrestle with. What is a framework? What can it do for you? Well, hopefully it will tell you it will help you organize what you're trying to achieve and organize your efforts to best get there. And if it can do that, it will be a wonderful tool. If it doesn't do that, it's not working very well. So this is what we aspire to. A little bit of history. Back when the first iteration of state wildlife action plans came around in 2005, the northeastern states got together and said, you know, we've got a lot of stuff we got to do. We didn't know we had this much. And when you start to organize it in a plan and articulate all these needs of species of greatest conservation need and so forth, you start to realize the volume and the enormity of the issue, and that landscape approaches will probably be more effective than dealing with them one at a time the way we historically did. So in 2006, the Northeast Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies got together with partners in the Northeast, Fish and Wildlife Service, and a lot of organizations, and said, you know what, we got to come up with a method to accomplish two things. First, we don't have the capacity individually as organizations to do the kind of work we need to do. Excuse me. And second, if we did it all, it would be incredibly redundant if we did it individually. So let's get together, put our heads together, and say, what can we do in common? And in a kind of combination of a 3-day meeting, they came up with about 72 or so priorities. Now, when you have 72 priorities, not many of them are actual priorities. So, you know, as most of you know, it's like, where do you start? So they put together a very simple framework to say, you know, there's some components of work that we know we need to do. We know we need some common classifications for talking about habitat. We need some common data sharing. We need to compare apples and apples. We need to look at what our highest priority species are across their distribution. So they organized their priorities in this kind of framework. And then they went beyond that and said, you know what, we're going to create a pool of money. And with the Fish and Wildlife Service Wildlife and Sport Fish Program and the Wildlife Management Institute, they put together a process called the Regional Conservation Needs, where they dumped 4% of their state wildlife grant money into a common pot to fund these priorities. So that was in 2006, and that perked along for several years. And many good projects came out of that. So then come the LCCs, and last year, Andrew Milliken, it's right over there, our coordinator for the North Atlantic LCC, put out a call for science and generated over 200 needs. Now, again, when you got 200 needs, you know, where do you start? How do you organize it? And when you look at even breaking them down by component, you know, when you have 39 different ecological planning needs, which one do you start with? So we needed some way to organize ourselves. So 5 years after the original Albany meeting, where the states and organizations got together and created the Regional Conservation Needs Project, we said we need to sort this out. So we got a big group again together, all the northeastern states, organizations, federal agencies, and said, what are we going to do? There were some objectives of this. We wanted to find out what we were trying to achieve in this geography. And what were some kind of frameworks to help us do that. And an understanding of this past work we had done. How do we organize all the good work that we had paid for already so that we don't create it again in some other forum? In other words, redundant spending. And how do we organize what we need to do from here on out? So these were the objectives, and we had to wrestle first with what we're trying to achieve. Now, the Regional Conservation Needs Program had a pretty simple desire to get together and figure out what kind of tools they needed to do landscape level work. And it was, as simple as that. The North Atlantic vision, you can see here, took that a step further and looked at landscapes to sustain natural resources. And this kind of boils down in simplified language to defining landscapes that can sustain natural resources at desired levels. So we have this fundamental objective of what we think, and this was talked about at our steering committee level at the North Atlantic LCC, and they said, this is what we think society wants of us as a conservation enterprise. They want us to achieve this. Now, this doesn't mean the LCC does all this, but this is what they want us to contribute to. And so the role of the LCC is a little bit more specific. It's to do these kind of things, and this is common to what you've all been talking about all week and all year for the past year and a half. It's what are we working towards, how are we going to leverage things, and how are we going to move forward. The conservation partners who make up the LCC also have roles that are specific to their organizations. And in order to make the LCC work, they have to bring these things. And you heard this yesterday in the engagement during the plenary session, talking about the role of perhaps a state agency or other organizations. Can you bring your priorities to the table so that they can be known and we can build them together into some common approach? And then can you try out what we're creating, take it back home, put it on the ground, take it for a test drive, and we'll refine and adapt as we go. So the partners have this role. In defining those roles, they came up with a number of components of tools or science necessary, things they thought they needed to achieve, or categories of things they needed to achieve in order to get to back to that fundamental objective of creating landscapes that sustain natural resources. So we had to have targets. We had to figure out what we know about species and their relationships to habitat. We had to come up with some kind of design work. And we had to look at stressors over time, and many things Tim talked about. What's going to affect this over time? It's not a static model. And then, very importantly, and this came out strongly in that Albany card, we have to translate this. We created an enormous pool of science that if you give it to managers on the ground, they don't know what to do with it. We need to translate this into tools usable on the ground. And then, of course, we need to organize our information and then monitor. We need to become a community of practice that gets together, figures out what worked, what didn't work, and how we're going to tweak it in the future. So there's lots of frameworks out there. We joke that there's probably 101 different conservation frameworks, but they all have common elements. They all have kind of an adaptive nature to them. And so what we were searching for was something that would not put us in a circle and an endless cycle, but help us to achieve those. What are we working towards? How will we get there? Who does what? And how will we know when we get there? And so, there are many different models. This is the Fish and Wildlife Service's Strategic Habitat Conservation Model. Again, it's very similar to many others. The elements of the State Wildlife Action Plan are very similar to Strategic Habitat Conservation. They all have similar elements. Some people like lists instead of pictures, and so this just puts it in kind of a list form and blows out a little bit. I borrowed this from Bill Uline. Bill, if you think it looks familiar, you'll see several of your slides in here. And this was borrowed from a business model that looks at what kind of questions relative to your outcome do you ask, and what kind of efforts do you put to come to bear to answer those questions and find out where you are in progressing towards outcomes. So this is more of a business model framework. So again, getting back to these elements that the LCC wrestled with, that said we need to organize these. These are common components, but they don't help us get to what step do we take next. And so this is what they came up with. And it's organized a little bit differently than the components. It expands a little bit, and it puts some I guess, some examples of questions you might ask to help you identify where you want to go. And so in the first category, this, again, is not rocket science, is not new. It's just a way of organizing the way we think. It's about, what are we going to work on? What are our priorities? What do we know about them? And what do we want to achieve with them? What are our targets? And the conservation design part, don't be fooled by this is only one circle. This is a huge part of science that needs to come to bear. But it really is, how are we going to design a landscape that is not stationary, but takes into account the dynamic stressors that are happening, but also we think can sustain multiple resources over time. This is a huge question, but it is kind of the essence of what we're about. And then, how do we translate that science, that aspiration, into something that actually is usable on the ground? LCCs by themselves don't do implementation, quote unquote, but every partner sitting at the table does. And one of the things that came out of our Albany conference was that, there's a recognition that the public needs engagement in this, and we need better tools to engage the public. We need better tools to engage communities, and we need tools to help us more efficiently do conservation. So this was added to the LCC's portfolio of kind of necessary tools to help the partners go back home and do implementation. And finally, the monitoring, the research, the new information, and this is important, for so many reasons. But also, when you think of our ability to act and do conservation, we're sometimes constrained by not thinking we have enough information. Well, the commitment to do learning from what you're doing and adapting in the future gives you some comfort that you can act now and adapt later. So we can't wait. It kind of takes away a little bit of the paralysis that might be there in the absence of some kind of feedback and adaptation. So that's where we are. So how are we using it? Well, the LCC staff, Andrew and his staff, have built this into a strategic plan for the North Atlantic LCC. In other words, it's what we are going to do. It organizes what we're going to do. It takes some of the existing work and puts it into those framework steps, that stepwise progression. It also helps our partners know what we've done so far and what we need to do. And so it becomes a very important communication tool for us to help realize what we're trying to achieve and where we are in that progress. It also helps when you look at those kind of steps, people start to see their organizations, their expertise, their capacities in ways that they might be able to contribute. So, talking about getting skin in the game, this is helping us get the organizations aligned with their capacities and expertise to contribute towards those outcomes. Very important. But probably most importantly, this helps the organization, the LCC, pick a direction and work very collectively and intentionally towards that outcome. It helps us organize it so that we're not doing a shotgun approach and just doing what we think is priority science today or tomorrow. We're working towards something collectively, and that's really important. So that's the Northeast region, and you've already heard Tim talk about what's happening in the Southeast. The Appalachian LCC straddles both the Northeast and Southeast, and some of the states, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Virginia, are in the Northeast Association, but they're also in the Appalachian LCC, and they hear about what's happening with the Southeast Director. So we're starting to get this convergence of ideas. And Bill Uline and I have talked about this a lot, of how to take the essence of what the Southeast states are doing and look at the overlap of purpose with the conservation framework that the Northeast created, say, this is pretty close. And the states are saying, can we create a common language here? Can we converge our thoughts so that we have a common conservation approach and vision. And I think that's something, that we'll continue to work on. I don't know how long it's going to take because people have ideas, but I think the opportunity here is to bring these systems together so that we have a more common vision and approach to conservation on large landscapes. And this certainly can be then perhaps looked at in concert with what the Western governors are doing. And when you start to look at the geographies covered by the Northeast, the Southeast, and the Western governors, that's a pretty big chunk of geography if we can get this moving all in similar direction. So going back to this question, did we achieve any of this with it? Well, I think it helped us with those first 3 bullets. But how do we know we're going to get there? And without apologies, again, I offered something Bill Uihlein put together because I think he articulated it really well about how we know we'll get there. Can we articulate a vision? This is how we'll know when we're there. If we can do these things, if we can figure out how much and how much more and where our conservation efforts ought to go. And if we can quantify these impacts and future impacts and future stressors, if we can do these things, we'll never quite arrive, but we'll be a good way towards what we ought to be doing if we can get there. So, again, this is what we're trying to achieve for society, and this is where we are so far in getting there. And I'll stop right there, and be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Got plenty of time for questions for either Ken or Tim, so the floor is open.
With respect to planning all this out and all the facets that you've described here, have you looked at what kind of costs it'll take to actually drive back some of these stressors in the opposite direction? Obviously, we aren't paying for all the fragmentation and everything and changes that are happening on the landscape, whether they're human-caused or not, but the fact is it's going to cost a lot of money over a large landscape, perhaps hundreds of millions of dollars a year, forever, and as a result, and just one small landscape, perhaps. Is that not going to be part of this process? I mean, if you don't identify what it's going to cost, or at least try to factor in the cost associated with it, then planning to do it doesn't really do anything.
Well, you bring up a good point about when it is a planning and a vision not worth anything because you can't get there. And so I want to perhaps answer it this way. One of the things that I think we're responsible for is not only measuring the stressors that are coming in, as daunting as they are, but I think we need to help understand what is necessary to meet the expectations the public has for having fish and wildlife around 100 years from now or more. So, there are stressors out there, and then there's what do you do about it? Each of our organizations have capacities on the ground. We're going to have to prioritize. I don't think we'll be able to do it all. But if we limit what we think is needed at this stage in kind of planning out what is actually needed to sustain fish and wildlife, not status quo, but fish and wildlife into the future, we're in danger of not thinking big enough and not picking the right priorities perhaps as a result. So I think we need to think big at this stage. We're going to have to get realistic when we go back home and prioritize where we're going to put our resources first, second, and third. But to do all this is not going to be go out and buy it. A landscape necessary is going to be through all kinds of methods, tools, incentives. We're already seeing, as a result of some of this, NRCS is starting to shift the way they're putting their incentive funds. That's pretty huge. When you look at, even in the Northeast, and those are not hugely agricultural states, but even in the Northeast, most of the states get millions, tens of millions of dollars a year in incentive funds. And if we can start to guide where the most important place to put those are, that's a huge step forward that we'd never been able to do before. So already we're starting to see those kind of positive outcomes. I know I didn't answer your question, but I think what the expectation is that if the public really wants fish and wildlife around in the future, there's going to have to be a kind of counter reality check about what it's going to take to get there. And if we don't tell them what it's going to take to get there, we'll never have a realistic conversation.
Yes, I agree with that. However, you know, in the whole picture, you still have to think about the cost of it, because if you present to the public or Congress or whomever you're going to get your money from, the taxpayer, to actually do something, regardless of how you put it on the ground or what priorities you make, you still have to give them the whole picture. And if you don't, I mean, if you look at the prairie potholes, for an example, they've had the joint venture working there, and they've been trying to focus about $250 to $300 million a year, every year, perhaps forever, as long as agriculture is a part of the landscape. And if you don't have that kind of money, or even start talking about it and making it a reality somehow, it doesn't matter how you prioritize things on the landscape. If you only have 1% of the funds needed to do anything, I mean, you really have to make that part of the process, because if you don't incorporate the cost at the early stages, and I'm not saying that this should scare you away, I'm just saying you need to make that part of the process. If you don't, then you'll be fooling yourselves and the public. So.
But the other counter side to that, though, is that we don't know what it's going to take, because we don't know all of what our conversation will generate in terms of public engagement. Let me give you an example. In Maine, we had a program called Beginning with Habitat, which went to communities and said, with this kind of information, said, how do you want to plan your community around natural resources as well as your own vision for the future? And the communities that got engaged didn't ask for money. They created a local vision, and they found ways to put it on the ground themselves. So it didn't cost us anything to put that vision on the ground. Now, it's going to take decades to implement those kind of things, but it would be impossible for us to generate a cost, because they're taking on some of that themselves. So I understand your question, but it's a really difficult one to just put a dollar figure onto.
I have the microphone.
Yeah, there you go.
I get to talk. Later today, Dennis Figg and Mark Schaefer are going to talk about this wildlife habitat policy research program that the Doris Duke Foundation funded over a 5-year period. And one of the studies that was done as part of that program was how much is all this going to cost, this being the creation of this national network of conservation lands. And the interesting part about it is that when you look at the money that's already being spent across the country, it's something like $9 billion. So the first order of business is to redirect the money we're already spending and be more strategic, as you said, as you explained very nicely in your presentation. And then to complete, and I use the word loosely, this habitat network would be about $12 billion a year, which sounds like a ghastly amount of money. But when you look at the local bond measures and the state measures and the local investments that you talked about, it isn't that much more money. And that study had just looked at limited things. It looked at formal land protection, through acquisitions and easements, and obviously lots of other things are necessary. But anyway, these things are flying around here. Pick one up. Go to the website, and all the studies are available on the Wildlife Habitat Policy Research Program website, WHPRP. So, Terry, they'll keep you busy for weeks reading all those studies.
There's in the back.
Thank you. Enjoyed your presentation, Roger Griffiths from NOAA. 2 questions. This is maybe coming out of the prairie chicken discussion, but the last two. Obviously, the conservation advancements are going to largely take place through public lands, especially in the Northeast, but other places. So the question is the role, the engagement of land trusts, for example, in your planning effort. The second one is, I know it's tough to get everything on the map. I noticed your map was white on the marine component. I'm hoping there's a parallel component for this on the marine. Thank you.
Yeah, well, the first question, relative to land trusts, and there are several major land trusts that are integral to the steering committee on the North Atlantic LCC, and I suspect on many LCCs. They've taken on a very active role in trying to organize more local land trusts. And so that component's there. They're asking for, well, what are the priorities? Where can we direct our efforts right now? Second question, the marine side, yes, very much. And Ellen McRae is here from NOAA, and she's involved in the North Atlantic LCC, and we're trying to figure out a relationship to the marine spatial planning that's going on through the ocean plan efforts. So very much our partners want to go from the mountains to the outer continental shelf.
Hi, Lori Rounds with NOAA and the Gulf LCCs. So my question is, as you were working through this, was there discussion about a species approach and integrating that with an ecosystem-based approach, and just some of the scaling questions and how you worked with that?
Yeah, very much, and Andrew talked about that yesterday in his presentation on a conservation design. There are really three elements of conservation design that we're working on in the North Atlantic. One is a representative species approach, a surrogate species approach, where trying to find whether some subset of species can fairly represent the habitat needs of a larger group. The second component of that is that not all species can be, and there are some rare and very unique habitat species that will have to be looked at individually, so that's the second layer. And then the third layer is some of the biophysical features that define some of the ecological functions, so some of the aquatic systems and the wetlands and rivers and so forth, and some of the spatial patterns and connectivity patterns. So it really is kind of a three-phase approach to developing a landscape design, not relying just on species, but using species as kind of an integrator of many habitat functions that we can't define otherwise. They really are a great integrator of what they really need.
Hi there, Dave Hankel out of Florida, Jacksonville, for Fish and Wildlife Service. I wanted to go back to the gentleman's earlier question. And money is a big deal, no question about it. I live in conservation delivery world, so I feel like maybe a little bit of a fish out of water this week with a lot of the scientists around. But Tim asked me to come, and so I did. Anyway, so I work with him quite a bit. But I think that the funding issues are huge, particularly when you're talking about proactive conservation efforts, because there's not a lot of extra money lying around, and it certainly requires that type of resource to shape things. But at the same time, there's a lot of money spent, and there's an awful lot of decisions made. I've supervised an office in Jacksonville, Florida. I have two other counterparts for the state, and between the three of us, we probably make close to 5,000 decisions a year that guide land use changes. And our ability to know where to point folks, to put things in the right place, they're going to make some decisions. They're going to either develop or not develop. They're going to mitigate or not mitigate. And the ability to steer those kind of decisions to the right places is huge, as opposed to, as Tim likes to say, random acts of conservation. So that I think has a tremendous effect that's out there. Also, in a more developed private landscape like we have in the Southeast, we have folks that are making decisions on mitigation banks and those types of things, and our ability to tell those folks where they can best invest their resources, where they should go to look for the biggest benefit and return on their investment, is huge. So I think while we may wind up a bit short on the discretionary funding end of things, at least I think we can shape decisions that is going to have a significant effect. And also, at the end of the day, if in fact the local communities and the Congress, the American people are coming to us and saying, what is it we need to do to get to this next vision, we can at least stand there with a straight face and say, well, here's, we're already making the best use that we can of the resources that we have. And so it's easier to ask for more when you can make the case that you're doing a good job already. So more of a comment than anything else. If I was going to ask you a question, I'd say, do you have 2 or 3 lessons learned from all of this that you could provide to folks?
I certainly could come up with probably half a dozen with time, but one is that the time that you spend on developing the relationships that make this kind of conversation possible, the importance of that cannot be underestimated. I mean, when I look at what an LCC's potential to achieve is, it's like way up here. But these are partnerships that take a lot of care and feeding, and a lot of trust, and the ability to develop that trust, or the time necessary to develop that trust, cannot be underestimated in importance. So that's one lesson learned, and I know we got kind of a jump start here because of the way the state directors came together with the Regional Conservation Need Program. That was a huge jump start. But the conversations between states and between the Fish and Wildlife Service and between partners had already been going on for a long time in the Atlantic Coast Joint Venture that Andrew was actually coordinator of for 10 years. And so, these are long-standing trust-building relationships that I think really are necessary to get this kind of coordination going. And Andrew, something you want to build?
Yeah, well, the microphone came my way, so I thought I'd add to that. But I think a really important lesson that we learned through this collaborative workshop with about 90 partners that we pulled together was, we all got really excited working on biological assessment and conservation design and developing decision support tools, and I'm still really excited by that work. But our conservation partners really grounded us that if we aren't translating that information to the scale and format that's needed, working with partners, making decisions, making that information available, and actually teaching them how to use it, and going to the people that are using it, and organizing our information in a way that they can get at it, then none of that other stuff matters. And so that they actually really redirected a major focus of our LCC towards those boxes that say science translation, conservation adoption, and information management. We're not getting away from the top 3 boxes, but we're putting a lot more emphasis in the southeast quadrant there. And so that was a major lesson learned for me anyway.
Yeah, it sure was. How to be relevant.
Anybody else? Last question?
Okay, good.
Thanks, Ken.
Yeah.
All right, so yeah, thank you all for attending. Lunch is started 12:45. In this room will be the Wildlife Habitat Policy Research Program and the National Fish, Wildlife and Plants Climate Adaptation Strategy, both national initiatives that LCCs could kind of take some leadership and some ownership of. So invite you back at 12:45, and thank you again. Appreciate it.